There's a mental habit most people repeat every single day, and Edgar Cayce warned it quietly shapes the outcome of their lives. He called it the silent architecture of thought. Not affirmations, not visualization, something deeper, something that operates beneath awareness, restructuring perception without permission. Cayce described it in readings given between 1923 and 1944, but neuroscientists are now seeing the same pattern in brain scans. A recursive loop that doesn't just influence behavior, but alters the neurological substrate of decision-making itself. The mechanism is so subtle that most people never realize they're trapped inside it. And once it begins, it doesn't stop. It compounds. If you're watching this, you're already halfway through the pattern. Subscribe now. The second half is where it changes. Cayce didn't call it manifestation. He called it meeting the self. He said that consciousness doesn't flow forward in a straight line. It doubles back. It observes itself. And in that observation, it selects. Not consciously, not deliberately, but it selects. Researchers at Princeton's Global Consciousness Project have recorded anomalies in random number generators during moments of collective focus, data that shouldn't exist if thought were purely internal. Satellites have tracked coherence patterns in Earth's magnetic field during global emotional events. Glacial core samples reveal isotopic shifts that align with historical turning points in human collective awareness. These aren't metaphors, they're measurements. And they all point to the same conclusion. Attention isn't passive, it's an organizing force. But here's where Cayce's teaching diverges from everything else. He said the force doesn't work on the external world first. It works on the perceiver. It reshapes the lens. And once the lens changes, the world reflected through it appears to have changed as well. But it hasn't. You have. That's the inversion most people miss. They think they're trying to control outcomes. Cayce said they're actually sculpting their own perceptual field, and the mechanism that does the sculpting is time itself. Not time as a calendar, time as a cognitive container. Cayce described something he called the eternal now, not as mystical jargon, but as a literal description of how memory, anticipation, and present moment awareness collapse into a single experiential layer. Modern psychology calls this the specious present, a window roughly 3 seconds wide where past and future blur into now. But Cayce said the window can widen, or narrow, depending on one thing: what you repeat in your mind when you're not paying attention. That's the habit, the silent one, the one that runs in the background while you're scrolling, walking, waiting, drifting. Cayce said most people spend that time rehearsing fear. Not dramatic fear, quiet fear. Micro-narratives of inadequacy. Mental scripts about what might go wrong, who might judge, what's already been lost. He said the repetition of those scripts doesn't just create emotion, it trains the brain to filter incoming data through a lens of scarcity. And over time, scarcity becomes the only thing the brain can see. Not because the world is scarce, because the perceiver has been conditioned to reject abundance as irrelevant noise. Neuroplasticity studies confirm this. The brain doesn't store reality, it stores predictions. It builds models of what to expect next, then filters sensory input to match those models. If the model predicts rejection, the brain amplifies social cues that confirm rejection and suppresses cues that suggest acceptance. If the model predicts failure, the brain selectively encodes memories of failure and discards memories of success. This isn't conscious, it's automatic. And it's fast. Faster than thought, faster than willpower. Cayce said this is why affirmations don't work for most people. Because affirmations are conscious, and the loop they're trying to override is not. He gave a reading in 1932 to a woman who asked why her life kept repeating the same painful patterns despite her efforts to change. Cayce told her the patterns weren't in her circumstances. They were in her inner conversation, the voice that narrated her experience to herself when no one else was listening. He said that voice was shaping her future faster than her actions ever could, because the voice determined what she noticed, what she remembered, what she expected. And expectation, he said, is the invisible hand that arranges coincidence. This is where it gets strange. Cayce didn't say expectation attracts outcomes. He said it selects them from a field of possibilities that already exist. He described reality as layered, not in a metaphysical sense, but in a probabilistic one. Multiple potential timelines running parallel, each one emerging or collapsing depending on where attention is directed. Quantum physicists describe something similar: superposition, wave function collapse, observer effect. The act of measurement doesn't just reveal a particle's position, it forces the particle to choose one. Before measurement, it exists in all positions simultaneously. Cayce said human consciousness does this constantly, unconsciously, with events. Not particles, events. And the measurement tool isn't a machine, it's the inner conversation. But here's the contradiction. If the inner conversation is shaping outcomes, why do most people's lives look nothing like what they consciously want? Cayce had an answer. He said the inner conversation isn't what you say to yourself in moments of clarity. It's what you return to in moments of distraction. And most people return to the same 3 or 4 thoughts, over and over, without realizing it. Thoughts about being behind, thoughts about being too late, thoughts about what's already been decided. He called these karmic grooves, not because they're punishment, but because they're momentum. The more you return to them, the deeper they carve into the structure of perception, until perception becomes prediction, and prediction becomes experience. Deep ocean sensors have recorded low-frequency vibrations that correlate with shifts in collective human stress levels. Magnetic anomalies spike during periods of societal transition. Satellite imagery shows measurable changes in atmospheric ionization during moments of mass synchronized focus. Events like global prayers, disasters, sporting finals. The data suggests consciousness isn't contained within individual skulls. It bleeds into the environment, and the environment, in turn, feeds back. Cayce said this feedback loop is the real mechanism of fate, not divine decree, not random chance, just feedback. And the signal being fed back is always the one you've been broadcasting on repeat. He gave an example. A man who constantly thinks, "I never have enough," will unconsciously filter opportunities through a lens of insufficiency. Even when abundance appears, the brain will reinterpret it as temporary, conditional, or undeserved. Not because the man is pessimistic, because his perceptual system has been trained to encode insufficiency as baseline reality. And baseline reality becomes self-fulfilling. Not through magic, through selective attention, through motivated reasoning, through confirmation bias, operating at a speed faster than conscious correction. Cayce said the only way out is to change the baseline. And the only way to change the baseline is to change what you repeat when you're not trying. This is where the second contradiction appears. How do you change something you're not aware you're doing? Cayce's answer was simple, but uncomfortable. You don't try to control the thought. You observe it, without judgment, without correction. Just observe. He said observation alone disrupts the loop, because the loop requires unconsciousness. It requires autopilot. The moment you see the thought as a thought, not as truth, the loop loses its grip. Not immediately, not permanently, but enough to create a gap. And in that gap, a different thought can enter. Not forced, not manufactured, just allowed. He compared it to tuning a radio. You don't create the signal, you align with it. And alignment isn't effort, it's release. Release of the static. Release of the habitual frequency. Neuroscience supports this. Studies on cognitive diffusion show that labeling a thought as just a thought reduces its emotional charge and weakens its behavioral pull. Mindfulness research reveals that non-judgmental observation of mental patterns increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for executive control, and decreases activity in the amygdala, the region responsible for threat detection. Cayce described the exact same process 80 years before fMRI machines existed. He said the goal isn't to think positive thoughts, it's to stop being hypnotized by repetitive ones. But then comes the third contradiction, the one that makes the entire teaching feel paradoxical. If you're supposed to observe the thought without trying to change it, how does change actually happen? Cayce said change doesn't happen through will, it happens through resonance. You don't force a new frequency, you stop reinforcing the old one. And nature abhors a vacuum. When the old frequency weakens, a new one naturally rises to fill the space. But it won't be the one you expect. It won't be the one you planned. Because planning is still the same mind trying to control the outcome. And the mind that created the problem can't solve it. It can only step aside. Glacial ice from Greenland contains air bubbles trapped during the last major shift in human civilization, the transition from nomadic to agricultural life. Chemical analysis of those bubbles shows a spike in methane and carbon isotopes that align with mass behavioral change. The shift wasn't gradual, it was punctuated, sudden, as if millions of people changed their perception of time simultaneously. Cayce said history doesn't move in a line, it moves in collapses. Long periods of repetition, then sudden reorganization. And the reorganization always begins internally, in the collective inner conversation, before it manifests externally. The fall of empires, the rise of revolutions, the collapse of certainties. All of them begin the same way. Someone stops repeating the old thought. Cayce gave a reading in 1938 to a man who asked when his financial situation would improve. Cayce didn't answer with a date. He said, "When you stop asking when." The man didn't understand. Cayce explained. The question, when, assumes the desired outcome is distant, and assuming distance creates distance. Not because the universe is punishing you, because your perceptual system is wired to see what it expects. If you expect delay, your brain will encode delay as the dominant feature of every experience. Even progress will feel like stalling. Even opportunity will feel like waiting. The man asked what he should do instead. Cayce said, "Live as if it has already occurred. Not in fantasy, in attention." This isn't positive thinking. Positive thinking is cognitive overlay, a forced narrative applied to uncomfortable reality. What Cayce described is perceptual reorientation, a shift in what you notice first. If you walk into a room expecting hostility, your eyes will scan for threats. Your memory will encode moments of tension and discard moments of warmth. You'll leave the room convinced everyone was cold. But if you walk into the same room expecting nothing, just open, neutral observation, your brain won't filter. You'll see the whole room. And the whole room contains both warmth and tension. But only one will feel like truth. And which one feels like truth depends entirely on what you've been repeating before you walked in. Satellite data from NASA's magnetospheric multiscale mission shows that Earth's magnetic field doesn't just respond to solar activity, it responds to patterns. Repeating electromagnetic pulses create temporary coherence in the field structure. Random pulses create chaos. Cayce said human thought works the same way. Repetition creates coherence. Coherence creates structure, and structure becomes experience. The structure isn't out there, it's in the perceiver. But because the perceiver is also part of the environment, the structure bleeds into the field, and the field reinforces the structure. This is the feedback loop he kept warning about. Not law of attraction, law of resonance. You don't attract what you want, you resonate with what you repeat. And here's the inversion that changes everything. Most people think the goal is to repeat positive things. Cayce said the goal is to stop repeating anything, because repetition is the cage. It doesn't matter if you're repeating fear or hope. Repetition turns thought into identity, and identity becomes prison. He said the freest state of consciousness is one that doesn't loop. It flows, it responds, it adapts, but it doesn't return to the same internal script every time the external world triggers uncertainty. That script is the habit, the silent one, the one you're performing right now without realizing it. Peer-reviewed studies on default mode network activity show that the brain's resting state isn't rest, it's rehearsal. When you're not focused on a task, your brain doesn't go quiet. It replays social interactions, it simulates future scenarios, it reinforces narrative identity. And the narrative it rehearses most frequently becomes the filter through which all new information is processed. Cayce called this the Akashic imprint. Not a mystical record, but a cognitive one. A self-reinforcing loop where past repetition predicts future perception, and future perception selects past memories to validate itself. The loop is closed, airtight, unless you see it. He said seeing it is the hardest part, because the loop doesn't feel like a loop. It feels like you. It feels like truth. It feels like the way things are. And maybe it is the way things are, but only because you've been repeating the same interpretation for so long that your brain has optimized itself around that interpretation. Optimized so well that contradictory data gets rejected before it reaches conscious awareness. Cayce said this is why people don't change even when they want to, because wanting happens in the conscious mind, but filtering happens below it. And the filter was carved by the inner conversation you stopped paying attention to years ago. Magnetic field anomalies recorded during the 2011 Tohoku earthquake showed fluctuations that began hours before the seismic event, not after. Before, as if the Earth's field responded to the buildup of tension before the ground moved. Cayce said human consciousness works in reverse like this too. The outcome doesn't follow the thought follows the resonance. And the resonance has already been building beneath awareness for much longer than you think. By the time you notice the problem, the pattern has already set. The question isn't how to fix the outcome. The question is how to disrupt the resonance before it crystallizes into form. He gave a reading in 1943, near the end of his life, to a woman terrified of the future. She asked if the war would end, if her son would survive, if the world would recover. Cayce didn't answer any of her questions. He said, "You are asking about a future that does not exist yet, and in asking, you are building it." She didn't understand. He said every time she imagined the worst, her brain encoded that image as expectation. And expectation isn't neutral, it's preparation. The brain prepares the body for what it expects, and the body's preparation sends signals into the field. Hormones, electromagnetic patterns, behavioral cues, all of them biased toward the expected outcome. Not because the universe is listening, because you're pre-selecting the version of reality your nervous system is prepared to encounter. She asked how to stop. Cayce said, "You don't stop by trying. You stop by redirecting attention the moment you notice the loop starting. Not to a better thought, just to something present, something real, a sound, a sensation, a color. Anything that isn't narrative, because narrative is where the loop lives, and the loop doesn't survive in the present. It only survives in the gap between past and future, the mental space where you replay what happened and pre-live what might." Cayce said most people spend 90% of their waking attention in that gap. And the gap is where time manipulates consciousness, not the other way around. Neurological data from patients recovering from PTSD shows that intrusive thoughts don't decrease through suppression. They decrease through recontextualization. The moment a patient learns to observe the thought without becoming it, the thought loses its autonomy. It stops triggering the full physiological cascade. The amygdala quiets. The prefrontal cortex re-engages. The thought becomes data instead of identity. Cayce described the same process. He said healing isn't about removing the thought, it's about removing your belief that the thought is you. And once that belief dissolves, the thought continues, but it no longer controls. This is the final contradiction. The teaching sounds like it's about control, but it's actually about surrender. Not surrender to circumstances, surrender to the present. Cayce said the present is the only moment where consciousness is free. Past and future are both constructs. Memory and imagination compressed into narrative, and narrative is where the loop hides. If you live in narrative, you live in the loop. If you return to the present, even for 3 seconds, the loop loses power. Not because the present is blissful, because it's unscripted. And the unscripted moment is the only place where a new frequency can emerge. Deep ocean hydrothermal vents emit chemicals that shouldn't exist at those pressures. Chemists call them prebiotic molecules, the building blocks of life assembling in conditions that should prevent assembly. Cayce said consciousness works the same way. It assembles outcomes in conditions that should prevent them, but only when it stops trying to force the assembly. Only when it surrenders the script. And the script you're surrendering isn't the one you wrote consciously. It's the one you've been whispering to yourself in every moment of distraction for the last 20 years. He said the whisper is always the same. It's always some version of, "I am separate. Separate from what I want, separate from who I need to be, separate from the life I should be living." And separation is the root of the loop. Because separation creates tension, and tension demands resolution. So the mind starts strategizing, planning, rehearsing, trying to close the gap. But every strategy reinforces the belief that the gap exists. And the belief in the gap is what creates it. Not metaphorically, neurologically. The brain encodes separation as the primary filter. And once the filter is set, the brain can't see connection even when it's right in front of you. Cayce said this is why effort fails, because effort assumes distance, and assuming distance makes distance real. The alternative isn't inaction, it's alignment. You don't try to get what you want, you stop resisting what's already emerging. And what's emerging is always a reflection of the frequency you've been broadcasting beneath your own awareness. If the frequency is fear, fear reflects back. Not as punishment, as echo. And the echo will continue until the broadcast changes. But the broadcast doesn't change through willpower. It changes through observation. And observation requires one thing: stopping long enough to hear what you've been saying to yourself when no one's listening. Satellite telemetry from the Swarm mission shows that Earth's magnetic poles are shifting faster now than at any point in recorded history. The North Magnetic Pole has drifted over 1,000 kilometers in the last 50 years. Scientists don't know why. Cayce said shifts in collective consciousness precede shifts in physical systems. Not because consciousness controls the planet, Because consciousness and the planet are part of the same field, and when the field reorganizes, everything in it reorganizes, including you, including what you thought was solid, including what you thought was you. And maybe that's the real teaching. Not that thought shapes reality, but that what you think is thought might not be thought at all. It might just be an echo of the last thing you didn't finish feeling.